Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a chilling collection of paranormal stories for you to enjoy. So get comfortable and let the ghosts take control. My friend's mum was deeply into spirits and seances. She continually talked about how their house was haunted by a relative she called Uncle Fred, who had supposedly died there years earlier. And because of this, every strange noise or misplaced object, of course, was the work of Fred. At 13 years old, I thought the whole thing was ridiculous. I just assumed she was eccentric and liked attention, and my friend mostly just went along with it because he'd grown up hearing it all his life. Well, one summer night I stayed over at his house for the first time. We spent most of the evening messing around playing games and eating junk food, and eventually smoking way too much weed for a couple of 13-year-olds. By the end of the night we were completely exhausted, and probably took 20 bong hits between us, before finally crashing at around 11. I only mention that because under normal circumstances I should have slept straight throughout the night without moving. But instead, I woke up at 2:32 in the morning, fully alert. The living room was almost completely dark, except for the thin bars of moonlight coming through the blinds. For a few seconds I just lay there on the couch staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what it was that woke me. The house was silent. After debating it for a moment, I decided I was thirsty, so I got up to get some water from the kitchen. Well, the moment I stepped into the hallway, the temperature drastically changed. The air became freezing cold. It felt like walking into an abandoned basement in the middle of winter, and it made the hair on my arms stand on end. At the same time, I felt a faint movement of air brush past me, even though none of the windows were open and the AC wasn't running. Then came this overwhelming sensation that someone was standing nearby watching me. It's hard to explain that feeling if you've never experienced it before. It wasn't hearing footsteps or seeing movement at first. It was almost like every part of my body suddenly knew that I was no longer alone. And that's when I heard this faint whispering. It was too quiet to make out any actual words, but it was certainly there, and it sounded close enough that I turned my head towards it. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I was going to throw up. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination reacting to the silence and the weed, but the feeling only got worse the longer I stood there. I hurried back into the living room and laid back down on the couch, pulling the blanket up over myself, even though I was sweating now from nerves. The room still felt deeply wrong. The cold had followed me. I kept staring into the hallway, trying not to panic, while every nerve in my body screamed that something was there. And that's when I saw a tall shadow move slowly across the entrance to the hallway. This was no trick of the light. It was shaped like a person, and noticeably darker than the darkness around it, gliding along the hallway with this slow, menacing grace that made my chest tighten. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight as fast as I could, because I was absolutely terrified at that point. The flashlight shut off instantly. It literally turned off the moment the beam hit the hallway. Right after that, I felt something tug sharply on the blanket near my feet, and I yelled loud enough to wake up my friend immediately. He sat up half asleep while I started blurting everything out all at once about the cold and the whispering and the shadow in the hallway and my flashlight not working. I expected him to be panicked, to wake up fully and join me in hysteria, but he just looked annoyed. He said, "Oh, that's just Fred. He messes with people sometimes." He literally looked towards the hallway and said, "Good night, Fred," before lying back down and going back to sleep almost immediately. The temperature in the room warmed up instantly. The tension disappeared with it as well, and the noises. And there I was staring into the darkness, trying to process the insanity of what had just happened. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, I turned on the lamp beside the couch, grabbed the Xbox controller, and stayed awake until sunrise with every light in the room on. By morning I felt completely drained, but I also knew for certain whatever happened that night was real enough that I never wanted for it to happen again. Ghosts are real. And of course, I never slept over at his house after that. When I was about 12, my mum was pregnant with my third brother. Before that, it was just my little brother Alex and me. My mum and my stepdad, Alex's dad and the father of the next child. While my mum was pregnant, she and my stepdad had a lot of arguments. About 12 weeks into her pregnancy, she started bleeding. Because of the complications from Alex's pregnancy, and he was about 3 at the time, and all the stress, she ended up giving birth at 15 weeks. Keep in mind, we were supposed to go on vacation to my stepdad's side of the family. This is important later, but of course, due to the unexpected early birth, that became nearly impossible. He was born too soon and unfortunately passed away 2 weeks later due to internal bleeding. My stepdad's side of the family came to us instead, also to say their last goodbyes to my little brother. So we went to the morgue to say goodbye. Everyone cried, except my stepdad, which was very strange considering his child had died just a few days ago. After we said our goodbyes, everyone went back to our house. My mum was in the kitchen, and the rest were in the living room. That was when my mum heard the doorbell ring, but when she noticed no one got up, she asked why no one had checked. Everyone claimed to not have heard anything. My mum went to check anyway, but when she opened the door, she felt a cold breeze go through her. Of course, this could have just been the wind. And this is where the story starts. In the following days, in the evening, thumping sounds like boots could be heard upstairs, in the cellar and basement. Nobody ever went there, but it was ignored. Soon after, I started having dreams about water flowing through the walls, which is an oddly specific dream. Not long after, shadows could be seen from outside the window. We had curtains and a large sticker on the glass that made it impossible to see inside. But that's where the shadow usually appeared. When my mum went outside to check, there was nobody there. After the shadows appeared, she started hearing faint whispering. When she tried wearing headphones, it only got louder. As you can tell, whatever this was, mostly affected my mum physically and mentally, but there were also small things that seemed impossible. My stepdad thought she was crazy, but one day he saw a flower move in the living room. All the windows were closed, and there was no way for the wind to come inside. Yet, he still didn't believe it. Eventually, it seemed to go after Alex. While my mum and Alex slept in the same room, Alex would cry a lot and seemed to hear the voices too. My mum even filmed it and has a legitimate audio recording of something faintly saying, "Come with me. Don't be scared." I don't have the courage to ask her for it since it was a very traumatic experience. My mum called a priest to come to our house and pray for us. The day he arrived, he knocked on the door, and when my mum opened it, his face dropped and he took a step back. Later, he confessed he felt a bad presence inside. He told us we needed to go to where it all started, the cellar. That's where the thumping began. We all went up there and started praying. While we were praying, it sounded like 20 planes were flying above our house. It literally sounded like there was a war between heaven and hell, and after the prayer the sounds ceased, and Alex fell asleep in my mum's arms. The priest also advised us to come to his church more often. The next Sunday, my mum, Alex and I went. My stepdad didn't believe in ghosts, so he stayed home. About 15 minutes into the service, Alex started crying loudly and we had to leave. This happened twice, and each time we got home he would throw up a little bit of this black slimy stuff. Eventually, my mum sought help from people with more experience in these kind of things. They told her to put salt in front of the house and a special type of leaf in the corner of the house. Within days, that salt turned black, which meant it was absorbing negativity or something in the house, according to them. Soon after, my stepdad left, and they ended their relationship. I also spoke to a friend who had lived in the house before us. He told me he had the exact same dream, water flowing through the walls, and once again, only the mum and his family had been affected. He also said there were satanic symbols in the cellar, and that in the 1990s, a Filipino family had lived there. His family believed they performed rituals in that space. To add to that, the people helping my mum somehow described exactly what my little brother was wearing in the morgue, even though there were never any pictures taken. Remember the vacation I mentioned earlier? One of those paranormal experts told my mum we were supposed to die either on the way there or during the trip. Safe to say, we moved out quickly. My family, consisting of my husband and 2 kids and I, moved into this 1970s brick ranch house in 2020 in a quiet country neighborhood in a small rural town in Georgia. Last year, our teenage son started having severe health issues, leading to a diagnosis of Crohn's disease, along with EOE. As you can imagine, we had a tough first half of 2025, and the last half we tried to keep things light-hearted and fun. Fall is my favorite season, and we love Halloween. So in late September, on a whim, my son and I stopped by a local Civil War-era family cemetery in the woods that we usually drove by on a daily basis. Our goal was to check it out and take a few pictures, all as respectfully as possible. Everything was fine until we came across a young child's grave, and we commented on how sad it was. Just then, we heard a woman's muffled singing, almost humming in the woods behind us next to the grave. We looked at each other and decided it was time to go. Later that night, my son comes to our bedroom late at night, saying he heard the same thing outside his bedroom window. After checking it out and not hearing anything, we help him to go back to bed. The next day, as I was gathering laundry in the hallway, I saw a quick flash of a person wearing a white sheet walking fast into the kitchen. There was no one there. A few days later, as my husband is backing up out of our driveway in the early morning before work, he sees a dark figure of a man walking towards the back of the car. He stops and gets out, expecting to see our neighbor, thinking something was wrong, but there was no one in sight. He is a skeptic and doesn't believe in ghosts, but this has spooked him for a while. He later told me he saw a woman in our dining room wearing a yellow dress years ago, and never told me because he was in denial and knows I believe. The next day, I decided to cleanse the house and told whatever was around that it needed to leave if it had any ill intent of any kind. For months, nothing happened. Then after Christmas, almost nightly, I started sensing someone in our living room after we went to bed. It's like it comes out after everyone is asleep and hangs out in our living room, but isn't around during the day. The few times I've had to get up and get water/Tylenol, etc., and pass the living room at night, I've heard the distinct sound our lounger makes when someone is sitting on it and gets up, and I felt like I've encroached upon it alone often enough. I apologize just in case. But what are your thoughts on what this could possibly be? I worked as an abstractor for a title insurance company. If a person wants to buy a property, they order a title policy from my parent company. My company then assigns the project to me, and I travel to the county where the property is located and search the history of deeds, mortgages, and deaths for that property going back 60 years, sometimes longer. Each county has a county courthouse which houses the old deeds, mortgages, maps, and death records for all the properties in the area. It sounds boring, but it's actually fascinating to discover the history and sometimes dark secrets of the seemingly normal-looking houses all around us. The Atlantic Courthouse was built in 1838 and is considered a historic landmark. It served as the main criminal court for the entire area and was witness to trials and executions. Adjacent to the building, there's a giant oak that was used as a gallows for many an execution. The courthouse is considered one of the most haunted places in New Jersey, and several books have been written about its dark history. Halloween ghosts tour the area stops at its front doors and share stories of phantoms that roam the building's dark corridors. I knew nothing of its spooky history before I entered the old courthouse. To me, it was just another stop on my daily travels. I walked in, looked up the documents that I needed, and walked out without a second thought. However, my parent company decided I should be stationed there on a regular basis and leased out a cubicle and a desk for me to use as my base of operation. It was then that I began to know the other employees who worked daily behind the scenes of the place, and that is when I began to hear the rumors of weird occurrences and deaths in the building. I became close friends with the old guard at the front desk, and he told me of all the creepy things he has seen and heard on his lonely after-hours patrols of the building. He has seen the elevator be called to the second floor and the basement when no one else was around. He has heard whispered conversations coming from empty rooms, and he was even once hushed by a disembodied voice inside the main courtroom, and that is only a fraction of his experiences. He also took me on tours to the parts of the building that are off-limits to the general public. He took me up to the bell tower, where a former caretaker hanged himself from the rafters. He took me behind the courtrooms, where children could be heard running down the hallways, and a woman is often heard crying. He took me down to the basement, and showed me the ancient holding cells where prisoners awaited their executions in the dark, as well as the tunnel under the courthouse carved into the rock itself, which leads under the parking lot to the abandoned jail behind it. But creepiest of all was when he unscrewed a panel in the wall of the basement to reveal a hidden room with a dirt floor. Inside the room was an altar of stone upon which are carved skeletal faces. No one knows who carved those skulls or what the function of the altar is, but it is altogether terrifying. He also took me to the old sheriff's mansion that is attached to the side of the courthouse. It's a 3-story mansion that was the home of Sheriff Smith E. Johnson and his family back in 1886. The feeling inside that old house is intense. It's as if you have traveled back in time. The first floor was used as office space in the 80s, but the upper floor and attic seem almost untouched. It is in the attic that the Johnson children lived. One of the windows faces the old hanging tree, and the other is the parking lot and old jail. The thought of those children witnessing the executions gave me a huge sense of despair. That feeling itself hangs up there. My first personal experience happened as I came back from lunch one fine day. I said hello to the guard and walked up to the second floor of the main building. When I stepped off the staircase and turned to the hall leading to my office, I got the shock of my life. Several yards ahead of me I saw a leg. It was a left leg from the hip to the foot, and it was transparent. It looked like a wispy outline of an unclothed leg. It went from the wall to the right side of the hallway, stepping into the middle, and walked into the wall next to one of the empty courtrooms on the left. It was as if a person crossed the hallway ahead of me, but I could only see one part of it. Although it gave me chills, it wasn't frightening. It was more exciting than anything. I had my first experience, but it would certainly not be my last. During my years working there, I have been touched. I have heard low conversations. I have heard whooshing noises pass right by my head. I have seen the shadows of someone reflected on the walls where there was no one casting them. I have seen a person walking up close behind me in the reflection of my glasses. I saw a full-body apparition of a man sitting across the room from my desk and watched him blink out of existence in front of my very eyes. I have heard a woman crying from an empty stall in an empty bathroom. I recorded the sound of someone speaking to me up in the attic. I caught a shadow dress walking into a wall at the top of the stairs near my office. I've had items moved and taken away from my desk, only turning away for a few seconds, and I saw an outline of a child staring down at me from the attic window of the sheriff's house, as well as many other things that happened during a subsequent ghost hunt I conducted with the guard and a few others. I detail all of this and more in my book titled The Zayas Zone. You can find a link in the description. When I was around 5 years old, my family lived in an old mobile home that I honestly barely remember now. I can't picture the layout clearly anymore. I don't recall what the outside looked like, or even where exactly it was located. The only thing that stayed with me from that place was what I used to see every single night in the doorway of my bedroom. Almost as soon as the lights went off, a dark shape would appear near the tip of the doorway. Now, the best way I could describe it as a child was a floating black cloud. It didn't look solid or human exactly, but it also didn't look like a normal shadow. It would just hover there silently above the doorframe, darker than the room around it, almost like smoke gathered into one place. Of course, it terrified me. Every night, I would end up running out of my room, screaming and crying to my parents, because I was convinced something was watching me from the doorway. I refused to stay in there alone once it got dark. At that age, adults usually assume kids are just imagining things and are scared of shadows or reacting to bad dreams, so eventually everyone treated it like a phase I would grow out of. As I got older, I am happy to say I completely forgot about it, and years later, after I already had a son of my own, my grandmother and I were talking one afternoon about how my 3-year-old refuses to sleep in his bedroom. No matter what we tried, he hated being in there alone at night. We were casually discussing it when my grandma suddenly laughed a little and said, "Well, maybe he's seeing the dark cloud man you used to talk about when you were little." The second she said it, my entire body went tense. It was like hearing something I had buried so deeply, I didn't even realize I still remembered. I felt sick. I asked her what she meant, and she looked confused that I didn't remember. And then she told me that I used to talk about the cloud man all the time whenever I stayed at her house as a kid. According to her, I would beg her to keep the lights on because I was afraid I would see him standing in the doorway again. When I started speaking to others about it, everyone remembered me talking about it all the time. It had been real enough that my grandmother still remembered the exact same name I gave it some 20 years later. I can't fully explain why hearing it affected me so strongly, but I had genuinely forgotten the entire thing up until that moment. The instant she brought it back up, everything came flooding back. I wonder if my child is now seeing the same thing I am. I've never really been someone who believes in ghosts. I think there are a lot of things we don't understand, and I'm open to the idea that not everything has a clear explanation, but I've always leaned towards skepticism. I try to look for logical reasons first. That said, something happened to me a few months ago that I still haven't been able to explain away in a way that fully makes sense. At the time, I was living alone in an older indoor apartment building. It had a long hallway with multiple units, and my front door had a frosted pane of glass in the upper half. You couldn't see clearly through it, just vague shapes and movement if someone was standing close. So one night I was getting ready for bed and going through my usual routine of turning off the lights and checking that everything was locked up properly. Now, I remember specifically checking the front door and making sure it was secured. As I was standing there, I suddenly had a strong sense that something was on the other side of the door. It wasn't based on any clear sound or movement at first, more like an instinct that made me stop and look at the glass. When I focused on it, I thought I could make out the faint outline of a human figure on the other side, very close to the door, almost face to face with the glass. It wasn't detailed per se, just a vague shape that I knew didn't belong there, and the feeling that came with it was a heavy sense of dread. I was trying to figure out if I was misinterpreting the shadows, but I still couldn't make heads or tails of it. Eventually I stepped away and went to bed, telling myself it was nothing. I turned off the lights and laid down, still thinking about it but trying to relax enough to fall asleep. Not long after, as I was drifting off, I became aware of something in the room. I didn't hear a door open or any footsteps, it was completely quiet, but I had the distinct impression that something had entered the room and was now inching towards the bed. That's when I saw what looked like a dark, human-shaped figure get into the bed behind me. It was this solid black shape. I couldn't move at that point. My body felt locked in place, and I realized I couldn't speak or react the way I wanted to. I felt pressure behind me, like something was right up against my back, and that's when I felt a hand around my throat. It wasn't painful, but it was firm enough to make it hard for me to breathe normally, and I remember focusing on trying to stay calm and forcing myself to move, even though it felt like my body wasn't responding properly. After a few seconds, I managed to slowly roll onto my stomach, and as I did, the pressure shifted. It felt like whatever was behind me moved with me, and I could feel what seemed like fingers moving across my head, then down along my face towards my mouth. At that point, I reacted without really thinking. I opened my mouth and bit down hard where I felt the pressure. And the moment I did, everything stopped and the sensation disappeared completely. The pressure on my body was gone too, and I could move normally again. At the same time, that feeling of dread I had earlier lifted, and the room felt normal again. I stayed awake for a while after that, trying to process what had just happened. The most logical explanation I've come up with was that it was some form of sleep paralysis, especially since I was in that half-asleep state when it started. But the clarity of it, the visuals, the fact that I bit on something, no I did, and received a reaction, kind of makes it hard to believe it was sleep paralysis. I'd like to get your take on it, because I honestly don't know what to think about all this. I am 21 and have lived with paranormal activity as far back as I can remember. I seem to be the only one who was targeted, like waking up with cuts on my back or bruises. And no, I'm not talking about small cuts you may accidentally do to yourself. I'm talking about cuts so big and relatively deep, it would be impossible to do to yourself, or stuff falling on the floor. Well, one day I was helping my mum in the kitchen, when all of a sudden, the sink faucet turned on all the way. We both looked, then stared at one another. I knew what was going on, but I was surprised it happened in front of anyone else. She shut it off and ran to the living room, and I stayed and continued cleaning when all of a sudden it went off again. All the time when I would see the man in the hat. For years I'd been afraid of him, but glad he was only targeting me, until one day my sister and my little cousin were playing tag. At the time they must have been 4 and 6. Everyone was happy as my parents and I sat on the couch, and we heard them scream in terror, running to us, saying there was a man in my parents' room. Of course, we all ran in and checked, but no one was there. I immediately knew what they'd seen, but I wanted to be sure, so I asked them what he looked like. They both said the same thing. A tall man wearing a hat. My heart sank, not knowing what to do, that my family weren't safe either. I have antagonized the shadow person many times, telling them to leave my family alone and only to go after me. It was the worst thing I could have said, because my life from then on has been hell for years straight. For my birthday in October of 2024, my significant other and I decided to take a trip to New Orleans. She had been there once before, but it was my first time visiting. We flew in on a Thursday morning and stayed until Sunday. Our Airbnb was located on 730 de Main Street in the French Quarter, specifically in room 6. The building itself was beautiful and renovated to feel clean and comfortable, while still retaining the old original atmosphere and architecture. The first day was completely normal. We had an early flight around 8 AM and landed somewhere close to 11, and after dropping off our bags at the Airbnb until check-in was ready, we grabbed lunch at Pat O'Brien's, wandered through Bourbon Street, and later that night joined one of the popular haunted ghost tours around the French Quarter. The guide walked us through the city, pointing out supposedly haunted buildings and telling us stories about murders, fires, paranormal encounters, you name it, and by the end of it we were obviously exhausted. We headed back to the Airbnb around 11, got ready for bed, and not too long after that fell asleep. Now before continuing, I should mention two very important things. The first, I have never been a sleepwalker in all my life, and the second, my girlfriend is an incredibly light sleeper. If I get up during the night, or even creak a floorboard, she usually wakes up immediately. Well, around 2 AM, I suddenly woke up, standing inside a completely different room. I had no memory whatsoever of leaving the bed, opening the door, climbing stairs, or entering another room at all. One moment I had been asleep, and the next I was fully conscious and standing in an unfamiliar setting. What scared me the most was how strangely calm I felt at first. I remember thinking I could literally be somewhere else in the city and have no idea how I got there. But instead of panicking, I felt almost detached from the situation. My first instinct was that I needed to investigate the room I was in order to confirm or not if I was in the wrong place. The room we had rented was rectangular, with 2 queen beds, a kitchenette along the front wall near the entrance, and a bathroom tucked into the left corner past the kitchenette, and large windows and a balcony door that lined the back wall overlooking de Main Street. Now the room I was standing in looked similar enough at first glance to confuse me, but the details were all wrong. Where our 2 beds should have been, there was a couch. The tall windows and balcony door at the back of the room had been replaced by smaller rectangular windows. The ceilings were not high like ours either. They were lower and vaulted. There was no kitchenette along the front wall, and every few seconds I noticed other details that didn't match our room. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. I walked towards where the bathroom should have been and found a short hallway splitting into 2 sections. On one side was a bathroom, but on the other side was a small kitchen with counters, sinks, cabinets, and a microwave. I distinctly remember looking out a nearby window and seeing the lights of downtown New Orleans in the distance, thinking at least now I had some sense of orientation. The entire time, though, I had this overwhelming sensation that I wasn't fully controlling myself. It felt less like I was actively deciding what to do, and more like my thoughts were arriving a split second before my body moved on its own. I understood everything I was seeing, but emotionally I felt disconnected from it, almost like I was watching myself from somewhere further back in my own head. Eventually, I returned to the main living area, still desperately trying to find something recognizable that would convince me I wasn't lost or losing my mind. That is when I noticed another set of doors on the far side of the room. In my confused state, I convinced myself those doors probably led to the bathroom, and that my girlfriend would be inside. I walked over and opened them. Instead of a bathroom, there was another bedroom. The room was long and narrow, maybe 15 feet deep, with a bed positioned against the far wall. Lying on the bed was a heavy-set man who was bald and probably in his mid-50s, and looked like he had fallen asleep fully clothed, with his legs hanging partially off the side of the mattress. Everything after that feels slightly blurred in my memory. I can't clearly remember whether he jolted awake suddenly or slowly sat upright, but I do remember the exact feeling that hit me in that moment. Until then, some part of my brain had still been trying to deny what was happening. Seeing another actual person there shattered me completely. I started panicking immediately, trying to explain to him that I didn't know how I got there, that I was supposed to be downstairs in room 6. But instead of being angry or shouting at me, he remained looking at me with a completely blank expression on his face and said, "You're in room 7. That was it. I remember repeating back, "Room 7? How did I get here? I'm not supposed to be here," while completely spiraling internally. Then suddenly I was outside the room again with the door closed behind me. I don't remember turning around, grabbing the handle or physically walking out. One moment I was inside talking to him and the next I was standing alone in the hallway. That's when I finally realized where I was. I was standing one floor above our room, at the top of the staircase. I ran down as fast as I could. By then I was completely terrified and doubting my own mind. When I found our door, I was so shaken, I physically traced the number 6 with my finger to make sure it was really our room, before pounding on the door as hard as I could. Eventually, my girlfriend opened the door holding a fire extinguisher because she thought someone had kidnapped me and returned for her. I explained that I had somehow woken up in the room above us. Only then did I realize I was completely drenched in cold sweat, including my bed where I had originally been sleeping. Neither of us slept much afterwards. She wanted to leave immediately, pack our bags and change our flights home. But it was nearly 3 a.m., and we eventually convinced ourselves to stay until morning. The next day we walked around the city in near silence, trying to process everything rationally. We visited Mary Laveau's shop at one point, mostly because it felt comforting to buy something protective after what had happened. We ended up buying a blue stone that supposedly protected against negative spirits when dissolved in water beneath the bed. Strangely, nothing like that first experience happened again. We actually started joking about the possibility of a ghost in the room and nicknamed it Ghosty. We even started leaving little offerings on a small table near the windows, including a white claw, a Zin pouch because we figured if there really was a spirit there, maybe getting on its good side wasn't the worst idea. The second strange incident happened the following morning. I grabbed a coffee mug from the drawer in the kitchenette and placed it on the little table before turning towards the bathroom. The exact moment I walked past the drawer I had taken the mug from, it slowly slid open by itself and lightly bumped against my leg. It moved smoothly and gently. My girlfriend did not see it happen, but I told her immediately afterwards and both of us just stood there, staring at the drawer in disbelief. Later that same morning, we realized something else unsettling. The room above ours, the one I supposedly wandered into, was under construction the entire time we stayed there. We never saw a single person go in or out of it. I eventually worked up the nerve to walk back upstairs and check the room number, and it wasn't room 7, but room 9. On top of that, every room in the building used electronic keypad locks requiring a code to enter. And I still have absolutely no explanation for how on earth I got inside to begin with. It's all one big mystery, and I'd love any insight if anyone has any. Around 2017, I was waking up to a 5 a.m. shift at McDonald's. I left my apartment at 4:30. On my route, there are a couple of bus stops. I never see anyone at them during these hours, only on my way back from work, usually students since it's a college town. It takes me about 15 minutes to get to work. Within the first 3 minutes there's a light, and then a small bench for people waiting for the bus. No canopy or anything, and as I'm approaching the light I'm looking down at the sidewalk, and I see the pedestrian crossing and the area where the first bus stop bench is. My entire time walking this route at this hour, I've never encountered anyone there beside early morning joggers or the occasional pet owner. That morning as I approached the crossing, I saw a figure standing near the bus stop area. It looked like it was reaching out into the road, and its entire form was cloaked. I stopped to think about what I was seeing, but I had a hard time looking directly at it. I can't really describe the feeling, but that's all I remember from when I first noticed it. I told myself it was just someone who was very cold waiting for the early bus, holding something out near the edge of the sidewalk so the bus could see them. I stepped into the road instead of using the sidewalk to pass it. There was enough room to get by on the sidewalk, but I absolutely wasn't going to do that. There wasn't any traffic, so walking in the middle of the road felt like the better option. As I passed it, it didn't move at all. I felt tense, like my body was tightening in on itself. I was scared, but the feeling of how my body felt is what I remember the most. As I went by, I kept glancing at it from side to side to make sure it didn't move, but also to see what it was. I didn't see anything, except a sort of black shadow. After I passed it, and was a bit further down the road, I got back on the sidewalk and kept walking. I didn't turn around at all. I remember thinking about how the first bus isn't until about 6:45 a.m, and about why someone would just stand there like that, covered. I still can't explain it. On my way back home after my shift, everything was normal in that spot. Just the usual traffic and college students. Now, I would describe the shape as if you were viewing a Dementor cloaked, playing one of those harp-looking instruments very smoothly and slowly. Certainly a strange sight. Back in 2012, I had moved to my mum's house after having issues with my dad, so I had to sleep in my little brother's room. It was a small room with a large window, a twin bed, and a ceiling fan that had a string hanging to turn it on and off as well as the light. My little brother had the habit of trying to scare me by hiding and then popping out and giggling. I'd play with him and do the same. One day I'm on his bed just scrolling on my phone, when I felt the bed move slightly. I knew he did this, so I'm thinking, this little kid thinks he can scare me. I'm going to scare him back. And so I crawled onto the bed and sneaked up on him at the foot of the bed, and no one was there. I checked under the bed and it was empty. I was dumbfounded. I opened the door and saw my brother was fast asleep on the couch. That was the first incident there. A few weeks later, I was feeling a bit tired, so I decided to go take a nap in my brother's room. I had my eyes closed and was barely feeling like I was going to drift asleep when I noticed brightness. You know, like when someone turns on the light when your room is dark? Well, our mum had the habit of checking in on us by turning the lights on, asking what we were doing, and then turning the lights off and closing the door. She would use the light switch, which was next to the door, not the strings on the fan, just needed to clarify that. Anyway, I assumed it was her and didn't open my eyes. I didn't hear her ask the usual question, so I just said, "Turn off the light." But there was no response. The light remained on. I repeated myself a bit louder this time, but was met with more nothing. So I opened my eyes, and the door was still shut. I didn't hear the door open or close. I was confused and looked at the ceiling, when the light flicked for a few seconds and then turned back on. I remembered a friend telling me to cuss at the entity, so I just said, "Turn the lights off and leave me alone." The light did not turn off, but nothing like that ever happened again in that house. One night, I went to bed earlier than usual while my mum, Diane, stayed up in the living room to watch a movie. My bedroom was just off the living room, so whenever the lights were on out there, you could see it coming through under my door. I mean, I was used to it, but that night I had trouble falling asleep. I had been lying in bed for a while with my eyes closed, facing away from the door in an attempt to get to sleep, and everything was quiet except for the faint noise of the TV in the other room, which was not uncommon and I was used to. At some point, I heard my mum's footsteps come down the hallway and stop right outside my door. That didn't seem strange at first. I assumed she was just passing by or checking something nearby, and then I heard the door open. The light from the living room came into my room, and I could tell it had opened wide enough to let in a noticeable amount of light, and I heard her walk in. This was out of character for her. She usually never came in once I'd gone to bed, but I figured maybe she had been looking for something she thought was in my room and didn't want to wake me. And I stayed still, kept my eyes closed and pretended to be asleep. I could hear her footsteps clearly as she moved across the room. Then I felt the mattress sag at the end, as if she'd sat at the edge of the bed. The weight was distinctive enough that I knew where she was sitting, and that's when it started to bother me. It didn't make sense for her to come and sit on the bed and say nothing, and after a few seconds I turned over to ask her what she was doing. But there was no one there. The room was completely dark and the door was closed and there was no light coming in from the hallway. I tried to process what I was seeing. I got up, went to the door, opened it and looked out into the hallway. All the lights in the house were off, it was completely quiet, and I walked towards my mum's room and could hear her breathing steadily. She was asleep, and by the sounds of it had been for a while. I went back to my room and turned the lights on. I didn't turn them off again that night. Now, I've tried to explain it away as some kind of extremely realistic dream, especially since I was already lying in bed trying to fall asleep. I mean, that would make the most sense, but at the root of it all, I think there's probably a paranormal explanation for it, but it's one of the few experiences I've had that didn't feel easy to explain away in the moment. A few years ago, I was eating at this very old restaurant in Vermont that had originally been a farmhouse sometime back in the 1800s. The building still looked and felt old. At one point during dinner, I got up to use the restroom. The ladies' room downstairs was occupied, so one of the waitresses casually told me there was another bathroom upstairs on the second floor. My cousin came with me. The second floor had a completely different atmosphere from the restaurant downstairs. It looked like part office space, part storage area, with old furniture pushed against the walls and stacks of supplies tucked into corners. Everything up there felt quieter and more enclosed. I actually like old creepy places, so at first I just thought the atmosphere was interesting more than anything. But there was definitely an oddly isolated feeling up there, despite the restaurant being so noisy downstairs. My cousin used the bathroom first while I waited outside in the hallway, and after she came out, I went in and locked the door behind me. The bathroom itself was small and old-fashioned with one sink and those under-style faucet knobs you have to twist manually. I had barely turned around after locking the door when both faucet handles suddenly twisted on by themselves. The sound was so sudden and loud it made me jump. My immediate reaction was to yell at my cousin through the door because I thought she had somehow done it, even though logically, that made no sense whatsoever. Afterwards, I finished up quickly as possible and headed back downstairs feeling genuinely unsettled. On the way back, I stopped at the hostess stand and half-jokingly asked the hostess if the second floor was haunted. She didn't hesitate and said, "Oh yeah, he's a prankster." That response rattled me more than the faucets did. Just how casual she sounded. Before that night, I'd always been skeptical about the paranormal. I never expected to hear it personally. but seeing those faucet handles physically turn on by themselves in an empty locked bathroom was the first thing I could never explain away. When I was a child, I saw these ghost things. They were misty blue with long, pointy noses, very similar to Mephits, and bright red eyes. Each one was different. One was short, another tall and lanky, others were quite average, and some were woman-like. They never really spoke to me or anything, just watched from afar. When they watched, weird stuff with my vision or time would happen, like walking up the stairs and then suddenly appearing at the bottom of them as if no time had passed. This, as well as similar things, happened over a couple of years. One morning as I woke up, I was in bed, and 4 of them appeared all through the same wall. They all looked at me in a way they never did before, kind of sad and sulking, as much as their face could show as they didn't have mouths. After a few seconds, the lanky one looked at me and said, "We're sorry." I don't really know how I knew he said it, or what he had said, as I don't remember hearing a voice, but as soon as the word hit my brain, they vanished into a thinner mist, until that too disappeared, and they were gone for good. I'm just curious what others think this was. Also, a little side note, both me and my dad saw them, and I'm not sure if it's important, but I'm putting all the information I think could relate to it out there. Both me and my father have legally died and have been tested and have no mental issues shown up in medical tests physically and psychologically. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed tonight's collection of scary stories. I do need to give a tiny little announcement, but anyway. So some of you might listen to other channels, perhaps smaller ones. 2 channels that I know quite fondly, Papa Scare and J Nightmares, recently were demonetized, and I think a handful of others were as well, because they don't have enough interesting visuals on screen. Yeah, you can see where this is going. So I am going to have to try and change things up a bit. I know you guys love the dark screen, so I'm going to have to be creative in a way I can keep darkness interesting and different. But yeah, at the risk of being shut down, I think we better, follow protocol. I do have a meeting with my partner manager on Tuesday, so hopefully he can shed some light on any changes I might need to make. But just bear in mind, there is a distinct possibility the darkness may need to just change slightly. I'm not sure how. We'll figure it out. I'll keep you guys updated. But that's it from me. Until next time, guys, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.